exactly 2 o'clock, and I am impressed.
I know.
Everybody's here and sitting in their seats. Awesome. So, how many of you are coming to the demo today? Do we have one more coming in the door? Because you came to the dot painting exhibit that was here. So there's a few of you.
Actually, I saw it too.
All right. So a lot of you didn't see the exhibit, and yet you thought this would be interesting. Awesome.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
So I'm not going to read all the stuff that's on the paper. My name is Vicinanza. It's a nice Italian name. And so I do photography, I do acrylics and oils and mosaic work. I don't do watercolor. I'm always impressed by people who can do watercolor. And I got into dot painting, so I'll just pick one example to show you. And I brought a couple of examples today so that I could talk about what it means to do a painting like this. So this is on a piece of preformed wood. You buy these wood panels at any one of your craft stores, you know, Michael's. I think I got this at Michael's. And then paint it with a gesso. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But the idea of doing the dot paintings, I started in November of last year. Not this past year, but the year before. So a year and 2 months. And I was involved in it because I was actually quite ill for a couple of months and I was going crazy. I couldn't go anywhere. And I like creative expression anyway. And I found some dot painting images on Pinterest. And I went and I was like, well, what is that? So when I started, I bought myself a bunch of 3x5 canvas, 3x3 canvases. And I knocked out about a dozen of those and I recycled them. I would suggest that when you're starting out that you don't do it on canvas for starters, because you can't really, it's not like other kinds of painting where you can just brush over it and paint it again. It's very textured. So of course it limits what you can do with it if you don't like it in terms of repurposing the product. So what I want to talk a little bit about is there's multiple kinds of dot painting. So I have another example here which is not really a mandala. This is more like Aboriginal art. So there's a couple of different styles of dot painting. One is the mandalas, which is very popular. Another one is just Aboriginal art, and this is really not truly Aboriginal art, but if you've seen Aboriginal art, it's usually these gigantic pieces, and the artists sit on the floor and they crawl all over their canvas, and they're using huge tubs of paint, and they normally do a lot of large dots, and they do a lot of symbolic images, animal images in the Aboriginal art, but something that's not a mandala. So both of these are centered, as you can see. They do a true center as a focus point, but once I started doing more of them, I got away from using the true center and doing things that were off center. So what it takes, so when I say off center, I mean it's not a true center, it's maybe a partial mandala. So we're going to talk about what it takes to do one of these. It's always acrylic paint, and you can do the acrylic paint in a lot of different kinds of quality of paint. So I've taken lately to using a lot of metallics. So when you first do it, because you're going to seal them anyway, depending on mostly on what you do it on, but you're going to give it a shine. So you don't necessarily have to go into a metallic paint. But the things that you're going to want are a surface that you work on. So I don't know how many of you have a working surface. So this is more than enough space for a working surface. You can actually work in a very small space. You need what it is you're going to paint on. So once you have the idea of dot painting down, and you are simply applying dots of paint, and we're going to talk about how you get the kinds of images that you get, you notice that these are varying sizes. This is also sort of a windmill effect. And you can also see that in some instances, you see the white filler here, that's done with a toothpick. So you could go from a toothpick to something as large as this in terms of your dotting tool. So we'll talk a minute about surfaces. Once you get into dotting, you can dot anything. You can dot a wooden box. You can. So one of the things that I recently did is I went down here to the liquor store, and I asked them if they had any wooden boxes left over from wine or booze from the holidays. And he gave me the 4 most amazing large boxes like this with a slide-off top. It's not even a closure top like this. So it's a slide-off top, beautiful condition. And I paid $5, and I said, I'm willing to pay you something for them. And I paid $5 a piece for them. So I have these 4 gigantic boxes that I will end up painting. So one of the things that when you decide on your surface, you may need to gesso the surface. So we'll talk a bit about that. But you can do boxes, canvases. This is a piece of wood paneling. This is a canvas board. So a canvas board is like this. It's a flat piece of canvas that's on a cardboard, right? It's just adhered to a cardboard. And these are great in terms of the pressure that the canvas will accept. When you use a stretched canvas, and I've done a few on stretched canvases, but when you use a stretched canvas and a small canvas, maybe a 3x3 or a 5x5, they will tolerate a little bit, but the bigger you go on a canvas, the more you have to be concerned about how you're stretching the canvas with the constant pressing of your dotting tools.
What about metal?
So I haven't tried metal. At any surface, the only concern would be whether the paint will hold to the surface. So I ran into some issues early on when I was trying to paint on different surfaces, and I moved up to a multi-purpose acrylic. And so it depends on what surface you're going to use, but you can get the multi-purpose acrylics, which are really good for glass. So I'm going to guess that they would be good on metal. In fact, now I want to try one. So when you're constantly dipping and pressing on your surface with the dotting tool, depending on how big the surface is, if it's a stretched canvas like this that has some give in it, right, you're going to stretch the canvas even more so. So it's okay if you want to try a canvas in a small piece like this, but I wouldn't recommend it for a large piece. It's best to have something that's flat. Now, what you run into if you're going to use a flat canvas board like this is that once you paint it, you have to decide how you're going to frame it and hang it. So we are going to talk about framing and hanging as well.
But does oil not work at all? Just curious.
Say that again.
Oil, does it work at all?
If you dot paint with oil, so
I know it takes longer to dry, but
it would take longer to dry.
Okay.
So the one thing about dotting with acrylics, and oil will probably give you the same viscosity. You would have to mix a little medium in there probably, just so it has enough, so it's not dripping off your dotting tool,
Right, okay.
but that you can place it without pressing down on it.
Right.
That you place it. The idea is that the thickness of the paint will allow it to then pool onto the surface. So as long as it pools onto the surface, it creates a little bead, and you let it thoroughly dry. With oil, you're going to have to be patient.
Right, right.
But you obviously can have, I think, a little more flexibility with color if you're doing it with oil. Maybe even more flexibility with surfaces if you're doing it with oil. So the one downside of this kind of a surface is, it's textured, right? Because it's canvas. So I don't go through this process, but what you can do is you can gesso the whole surface and let it dry, lightly sand it, gesso the surface again, let it dry, lightly sand it, gesso the surface again, and you'll get a cleaner surface. You know, the smoother surface, like the surface of this journal or the surface of this wood panel, is much easier to work with because it doesn't have a texture to start with. So the less texture you have, of course, the easier it is to have a real perfection in the dots that you're applying to that surface. So when it comes to creating a design, there's a couple of ways that you can create a design. So you decide, first of all, what you're going to paint. So we will do a class here for beginners on the 8th of February. So you can see Becky if you're interested. And we're going to do a journal like this. So we'll provide all of the tools. And you don't have to prepare this surface. It's fine just the way it is. So you can start to paint right on this surface, and then when it dries, you don't have to do it the day that we're doing the class, but it's recommended that you put a sealer on it. And we'll talk about sealers in a minute. So there are templates available. You can look online. They're on Etsy, they're on Amazon, Michael's Craft Store. They have these hard plastic templates, the kind that you use for the stenciling class. You can get them that are pre-cut with all your lines and circles. So I use them once in a while, but normally I do everything by hand. So once I've prepared my surface, then I'm going to create my guidelines. And I typically do the guidelines in pencil, right? Just a standard number 2 pencil. I like a pencil because it erases easier. It's a little harder to erase on a textured surface, but it's easier to erase afterwards. A lot of dot painting artists use a variety of tools, and I thought I brought a charcoal pencil. So there's a couple of different kinds of pencils, but you can get white charcoal, you can get black charcoal. I know it's here somewhere. So these are your standard white charcoal pencils. And if I were going to create something on here and I was going to go ahead and use the center as a true center, what I want to do simply is to start to create some boundaries. So all we're doing is we're setting up boundaries. And I may or may not decide to follow all of those boundaries as the piece takes takes shape. So you can decide with whatever surface you want to work on. You can decide, do you want to work in 6? Do you want to work in 8? Do you want to work in 12? So the more guidelines that you put in, then the more you can create a density. And by density, I mean, so if you look at these circles right here, I don't know how many it is. It looks like about 24. So the more guidelines or the more dense that you make it, the more you're going to have a very small detail when you get down into the center. This is actually not a very big center dot, and I tend to shy away from really big center dots. So this is also a small center dot. So this is a section of 8. So, you know, it's geometrical. So you want to decide what's the geometrical boundaries that you want to set for your piece. And so once you've set those, so I would have crisscrossed this with a ruler and created the 8 sections, and then I would have created circles. And I do that with a compass, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But that's another reason why I'm not a big fan of a stretched canvas, because you're going to have a point for the middle of your compass, and it's going to pierce your canvas. So what it means is that you have to then treat that little hole you put in the canvas so that you can then paint over it and then paint the rest of your surface. So once you do this, you may have considered a color scheme. Maybe you're doing a project that you want to put in a particular room and you want it in pinks or you want it in blues or whatever the color scheme is. And you'll start to generate your painting supplies to support what it is you want to do with the piece. So there's a lot that I'm going to just run through real quickly right now about supplies, and then I'll pause for a moment for questions. So basically you need a surface to paint on, you need a way to draw some guidelines, rulers, and I'll show you some compasses. So for big, I have a lot of compasses. So that includes compasses that are industrial sized compasses for large pieces that I'm doing. So those are just for show. What I do like more than any other product, did I bring it with me? No, I think I left it on my art table. Okay, and you can see I have a variety of compasses here. But what I like, and I thought I had it, but I don't have it. So there's a compass out there that's 2 metal structures, and they go at each end of the ruler. So you can take it, you slip this into the one end, and you tighten it. And then so you can get a big ruler, like a yardstick size ruler, right? Metal is better because it's less flexible, it's less likely to create errors. So you can create like really large guideline circles. And you put that other piece, so maybe you started here, then you move it, it's like a little clamp, and you move it, you move it, you move it, and you just keep moving it until you have all of the circles on the surface that you want to use as guidelines. Now that's one way to create a template, right? So what we're talking about is you know what you want to paint on, now you want to put a template on that. And the template is hand drawn, or you can get ideas from these infamous adult coloring books that are everywhere. So, for instance, this is a bookmark that I have black gessoed, and so it's prepped. And I'll be painting, and I prefer to paint on both sides. So I'll do a little dot mandala on the 2 sides, and then I'll coat it with a sealer. I'll put a little dangly thing on the end, and I'll have a handmade bookmark. So that's an open project at the moment. So you can see there's hundreds and hundreds of mandala patterns. You can bring them from the internet, you can download them from Pinterest. I look a lot at Pinterest. So when you decide to use one of these, you can use just a standard tracing paper, and you make sure that you center it to the true center of your piece, whether it's in the middle of your surface or somewhere else on the surface, and then you trace it. So it would, and usually the tracing paper, well, the one I use creates a white charcoal outline. So when you're done tracing, you would actually have a pattern on the surface, and it's in white charcoal. And you can use that. So in this case, you don't necessarily trace everything. You know, maybe I wouldn't, for instance, do all these little acorn-like flowers in here. So I may trace some of this just because it'll give me something interesting to work with. And it's just a few guidelines. That's all we're looking to do, is to create some guidelines. And it doesn't mean you can't take a template of a mandala and trace the whole thing out and have it all laid out in pencil or charcoal on your painting surface. I tend not to do that. I like to see where it's going to go. So I don't have it all figured out in the beginning. But you know, there's lots of ideas that you can choose. So the question then is inspiration. So you have a painting surface, you have your tools, and then you have inspiration and you have a color scheme in mind. And so just quickly back to the tools, you're going to have your paints, and we'll talk about different sizes of paint containers. And you'll see I've got large, medium, and small paint containers. Your tools, and I have some tools here that I haven't tried yet. I'm always buying tools that look like they would be interesting to use and to try out. But these are very popular among dot artists, and they're manicure. It's a manicure set. So if you buy the whole manicure set, and I think there's 2 of them in here actually, right? They come in all these different sizes, and it comes right down to this very tiny size right here. So it's simply a matter of dipping the size into the paint that you want to use and then dipping it onto your surface. Now, depending on what you're doing, it's a little tedious. It could be dip, paint, dip, paint, dip, paint. But there is something called walking the dots, which I'll talk about. So you've got this option, manicure set, and you can get these on Amazon. But if you're going to take the beginner's class here, we're going to provide that. You can get these, which are standard specifically for dotting. They're dotting tools, and they're plastic, so they hold up better than the wooden ones, and we'll talk about that in a second. And again, these come in different sizes. Again, you could get them on Amazon. These are also specifically for dotting, so they come in different sizes. You could also get those on Amazon. And then you have things that you could jury rig. So this is a very inexpensive set of crochet hooks. And you can see they're well covered with paint. And they come down to a pretty small size and up to a pretty big size, right? So the downside with the wooden tool is that over time the wood will wear from the constant pressure. And what will happen is little chips will chip off the edges. And then you don't have a perfect dot. So I like using them, but I have used them less and less of late because I just need to throw them out and go get a new set. So it depends on how big you want to get, right? So you can make things. You can just, anything that'll give you a circle is a dotting tool. Even a small paintbrush or a toothpick, right? So I also do small dots with toothpicks. And then these I just picked up because I wanted to try them. So they're round, and I figured I'd give them a shot and see what I could do with them. And I'm experimenting right now with doing a 3x3 wood panel because I want to actually do somebody's wall. And so I need to know what it's going to take to do a larger size piece so that I can go in and actually paint one on somebody's wall. So anything that's a circle will give you, you can even use the end of an eraser, right? Or the unsharpened end of a pencil. You can use Q-tips, but if you're going to use a Q-tip, it should be the pointy kind. So essentially anything. You can maybe put a little, like if you create a point here and you put a little paint on it or a little glue on it so that it becomes firm. So you can jury rig, which means make it up and not spend a lot of money. So you've got all these different options for how you can create the dots. And I recently got a new phone, and I purposely bought a plain black carrying case, which I just got last week because I intend to paint the case, right? So you can also pick something out that you might want to paint. And then these, I've been doing these, I did a bunch for the holidays. These are cutouts that you can just buy at Michael's. Now the thing I will say about these, and then you could come up with all different designs for painting them. But I will say, these come untreated, and you have to black gesso every one, and I'd rather black gesso a single 3x3 piece of wood than 10 of these. So, But what's interesting is that you can do a design and you can, in 30 minutes have a finished piece of artwork. So that's not so bad either after the gesso dries. So, and then we're going to talk about paint. So I usually buy, depending on what I'm buying, like metallics like this, tend to only come in this size. So, and if something's on sale, I also buy it in big tubs and in tubes or if I can buy it cheap, I'll buy it cheap. And what I use is these are bead organizers for people who are beaders. And they come in two types. This type, which I bought mistakenly because I wasn't paying attention, doesn't have the little catch on one side of the lid, so it requires extra work. But you can buy the same exact thing, and the lid has a little, finger catch on the side, and it's much easier to work with. This is great for custom mixing small amounts of color, and I have probably 3 dozen of these with custom mixed colors sitting on my art table. But if it's something I'm using a lot of, like white or black, I have to refill this all the time, and I'm not willing to do that. So I actually am using these to store my large paints. This has become the thing that I most often use. So it's a spray-on Mod Podge. And there are spray-on varnishes, there are paint-on Mod Podge. So this one, I had run out of this and I did a paint-on Mod Podge, which is why it's so blotchy. I like the spray-on better. The spray-on isn't always in stock. I usually take everything they have. I was at Walmart last night, they had 3 bottles, I took all 3. I then went to Michael's, they had 3 bottles and I took all 3. So 2 stores went out of stock last night because I was on a shopping spree. So the spray-on is nicer because you get a better surface. Now the thing with the spray-on is because of the mist, right? You want to take care of your respiratory system. I would never do this in-house. So it's limited because I will only do this outside. And the reason I use Mod Podge is because of all the things you can spray on to protect the surface, this is probably the least toxic. So that's one of the reasons I go for Mod Podge. It comes in gloss or it comes in matte, right? So this one I think is a matte, I used a matte Mod Podge on. So this is a gloss and I would just spray it on and let it dry and then maybe do a second coat and let that dry. So when I start, I'm just going to pick out the size of the tool that I want to use to create the beginning of what I'm going to do for the artwork. And I often start with white, especially on a black surface. And so, there's enough, you can see that there's a dollop of paint. It's not going to dip onto the table, but it's enough that if I apply it to this surface, and of course, when you're doing the center, you're taking your best shot at getting it right on where all those lines intersect. So I don't know if you can see that there's now this little rise of paint, right? And one of my concerns about trying to do this on somebody's wall is whether I can do it with gravity. Yeah. So we'll have to see, but I want to give it a shot at some point. So you now have this little dot of paint, and eventually it'll settle down. So it'll come to a more even level. It'll settle into itself. It won't be quite so noticeable, but and then once it dries and it's settled into itself, then you can do a second or a third layer. I love to layer paint because I really like the effect that it gives when you do multicolored layers. One on top of another. So when you do the multi-layered effect, in this instance, every extra layer of paint is dead center. So that's one method, right? It's a very straightforward method. So if I did 3 layers of paint, each layer of paint is centered on top of the other layer.
You dry it in between?
You have to dry it. Yeah, otherwise you're going to, the paints will mix and it really won't give you a good dot. So you do have to let it dry, but it'll dry in 24 hours. So that's another reason acrylics are nice, because they dry so fast. So another method, and I don't think I have anything here that shows it. Yeah, okay. So this is another option. And this is where you get these cutouts. I painted the whole thing inside and out. You don't always have to paint the inside, but because this is not necessarily going to be on a wall, I decided to paint the inside because somebody may decide to just stand it somewhere. So that's one of the nice things about these kinds of projects. So in this case, I went with a true center because it's a star. It makes more sense if it's a star. I don't always do that, obviously, right? So like that's a true center, that's a true center. With a star, I tend to do that. Let me see if I got any that's not centered. I don't. So I do tend to center them if it's a star. And what I wanted to point out is this row of purple dots. So there's this row right here. It's dark purple, and so it's a medium purple, and it has a white dot added to it. And I may just pass this around. What you might not be able to tell is that the way that the surface is done, the way that the dot is done, is that it's against the edge, and then the next one is against the edge. So let me we can pass that around. Thanks, Beth. So by that I mean, right? So there's your initial circle. And when I put the next circle on, I'm putting it like that. And then the next circle like that. And when you do that all the way around the circle, it actually creates a very interesting effect. It may not work for all your designs, but you may have designs where that's all you do. And every one of your second and third layer dots are on the inside edge of the initial circle. So that if you do multiple circles around your mandala and you do your multiple layers like this, you have all of these dots that are sort of look like they're moving towards the center of your mandala. So it actually creates a very interesting effect. So you can
different colors in those layers.
different colors in the layers, right? So in the star, it is 3 layers. It's like a purple and then a white and then a pink, which is very pale. But they all move to the inside edge of the first circle. So that's one option. Now, you're always going to start the beginning of your effort with something that's small. Maybe the smallest, maybe something that's not the smallest, but close to the smallest. And all you're really going to do, and they're always going to be the same size. So when you start, the easiest thing to do, and this takes a little bit of work, right? You want to be as close to the initial circle as possible. And what I typically do is I will start on the guidelines and then decide if there's enough room for me to put a dot in between those guidelines. So if I get all the way around the circle, and I've started to work my way out, right? And I'm just going to build out now I cover the whole surface, right? I don't think I'm going to put another dot between those. I think that they're close. And maybe when I get a couple of rows done, I will go back and I'll fill in. And when I say fill in, what I mean by fill in is what I would typically do for the next row. The common practice, if all you're going to do is build a few circles for the beginning, is that your next row is in between. So you go in between and then in between and then in between, and so the rows are not stacked on each other, they're nested inside of each other. So if I were to, let's say, choose to do something with a little bit of pink, So one of the things that people can do, and I've seen people on YouTube videos do it. I'm not a big fan of it, but you can put some paint inside your cap, and you can paint from there. So maybe I want to do a pink, red, white, maybe a little lavender motif, right? I've decided sort of my color scheme. And the next time, I'm not changing the tool. So one of the things that you get more comfortable with over time is you can use the same tool, but you can choose to do a lighter dot or do a heavier dot. So the next time around, I'm going to choose the same tool, but I'm going to make sure that I'm applying a heavier bit of paint so that I am building the size of the dots as I begin to work my way out. And then as I work my way out, I'm going to start to change up my tool. And I'm going to change up my tool because what I'm looking to do is to get larger and larger as I work my way out towards the outside edges of the painting surface. So you can see, and they're not perfect, but they're sort of in between the white dots. Now I'm going to go back to what I meant by filling in. So even though they're in between the white dots, they're sort of nestled in there. There is this tiny bit of space between the white dots and below the pink dots. And when that all dries, I may go back with a toothpick, I do this often, and with gold paint, I go in between the dots with the tiniest little dot of gold paint using a toothpick. So you get this, you start to build character depending on what you decide to do with the blank space, essentially. How are we doing so far?
Do you keep it on a flat surface in front of you? Is
I
that-
do.
You do. You're just demonstrating.
Yes.
Okay.
So I didn't realize it was 5 minutes to 3 already. My goodness. I didn't realize I was talking so much.
Can you correct a dot that you put down by mistake?
Yes. So, absolutely. So I rely on Q-tips for that and saliva, but you could do it any way you want, right? So I would wet the Q-tip and I would go and wipe off the dot, and it may smudge a little bit. So I take a very fine tip paintbrush and I go over that section with a little black gesso, let it dry, so I've resurfaced it, and then I go and put the new dot back on. What that means is that I may continue to the next row before I come back and do the last dot in the row I was just working on. But yes, you can do that. You catch it while it's wet, and you can do that. So I'm going to do one more with a larger tool here. So if I take a larger tool, and I'm going to try with the red, the idea would be, right, so the larger tool gives me a larger dot, and I'm going to start to create the next row of dots. And in this case, I'm actually doing more than one dot with my tool because I have a sense of how much paint is on the tool, how much paint I need for a dot, whether I need more paint, and I'll just do this row. And then I thought I would get further along on painting something, but
Do you ever work besides black gesso? Do you always just work on black gesso?
so it depends on if I have to prep the surface. If it's a canvas, I prep it. White gesso, I do white gesso. So you can see
You've
that
done white ever? Or
I have done things on white gesso. The reason that I like black, of course, is that it makes the colors pronounced. Yep, especially the metallics. Yep. So essentially that's an introduction. I'll stay as long as you want, but I didn't realize that we had run through an hour. So any last questions?
Do you sand after you put the gesso on? Do you ever sand it? Or is that it?
I haven't, but I know people who have. I follow other dot artists, and I'm always watching what they do. And I have watched other artists who will do the black gesso, sand it, do another layer of black gesso, and then sand that, you know, till they think they have the really shiny, smooth, clean surface that they're looking for.
But you get that in the end when you podge it first.
So the Mod Podge it protects the paint and it gives it the luster. Yes.
Did you do,
So this is how we're starting to build this out. And obviously, there's a lot more that's gonna happen when this gets done, right? What's your next question?
was that the acrylics on, that you did the star with, or was that the?
Acrylics.
That wasn't the, what is it, metallic, it wasn't done with metallic?
Oh, there may be some metallics in there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I just have gobs of paint bottles, and whatever strikes me is what gets put on for that for that item.
It doesn't matter, any acrylic? Or is it
Well,
just
I will
about-
tell you that depending on the surface, like for glass, I would, and probably for metal, I would recommend a multi-purpose, right? So this black is a multi-purpose, multi-surface black. For glass in particular, I would recommend Martha Stewart's multi-purpose. I find that is a good quality for glass surface. Like if you want to paint a wine glass, or you want to paint a mirror, you know, so Becky and I were talking about letting you bring whatever it is you want to paint, and she thought for the first class that might be a little overwhelming, so we're all going to paint journals for the first class. But then, you know, we're talking about doing an advanced class after that, where you just bring whatever you want to paint, and then, which is sort of like what you do with your stenciling. People are doing different projects, and depends on what they need your support for, and you provide expert support. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, I'm sure it takes practice, practice, and practice, but why are all the dots so perfectly round and they don't have tails, or they don't have, look like eggs, or, you know?
So one is it's
Waiting
the
for it to have a
tool.
string.
No, but one is it's the tool. Another one is that, it's a really good question, I should have mentioned this. It's best, but you'll get the hang of it at some point, that you're straight down onto the painting surface. So it's straight down, straight up, straight down, straight up. Excellent question.
And then if you're using acrylic from a tube, does it matter in terms of the, you know, versus liquid? You're using liquid versus in a tube.
No,
Doesn't matter.
I'm thinking if you're using it from a tube, you're probably gonna use one of these small plastic pallets with little wells,
Okay.
and you're gonna mix a small amount with some medium.
But you have to put medium in it.
You don't have to if it comes out of the tube, because I have some tube paints that have a good fluidity to them, but not all tube paints do. So it just it matters on
You might need it, is what
you
you're
might
saying.
need it.
Because it might be too thick.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, with something like this, if I have a custom mix and I've used it and I'm like halfway down and it's starting to dry because it's a small amount, it's not gonna hold up with being exposed to air. And the other thing I'll recommend, so a bunch of you are probably painters, if not all of you, is, you know, if you're using a palette, just wet a napkin, double fold a napkin, paper towel, wet it, and lay it over because I'm talking about the palettes that have the little wells in them, and lay it over that so you keep, because the smaller amounts dry out faster. So you can just do the same thing here. You could just put a little like wet napkin or wet tissue over it while it's open. But I'll even add water. I mean, medium is best, but it's anything that'll give it the right fluidity. Anything else?
Do you ever add crystals like the Swarovski crystals to give some bling to you?
So I'm working on a jewelry box. I actually am working on a jewelry box for my granddaughter, whose birthday is in Monday. It's Monday, right, Steve?
I have no idea.
I think it's Monday. So,
13.
I took an old cigar box, and it wasn't, you can buy cigar boxes, you know, the mock ones at Michael's. I am not a big fan of those, because they have really cheap hardware on them. You can go to flea markets, tag sales, and you buy these old-fashioned cigar boxes that are much better in terms of quality, and they have good hardware on them. So I found this gorgeous old cigar box, nice hardware, I paid $1 for it. And I've been working on it, and I put one large, so it's about this long, right? And it's gonna be a jewelry box. One large mandala and then one small mandala. And then her name, it's just 4 letters, will go under the small mandala. And I have the little beads, I adhered beads in the 2 mandalas. So it's got that jewelry look to it. It's the first time I've done that, but I've seen other people do that. Anything else?
How old is she?
18,
20?
20, something like that.
20 or 21, I should know.
20,
right?
I think.
So Justin is my oldest grandchild, and she's my second oldest grandchild, but they're not sister and brother. She's got another father. So he's from my oldest son, and she's from my second son. But yeah, so that's going to be a custom jewelry box for her, and I did put little glue-on crystals on it. So you can, you know, dot anything. Once you get this down, you could dot anything. That's the bottom line.
Did you